It's now time for a devotional thought by Pastor Mark Finley.
Have you ever met somebody that was so humble, they were proud of their humility? I read a story once about an old preacher. And he talked about this young man. And this young man thought he was the greatest preacher ever, you know. And the young man goes up into the pulpit very proud, very arrogant. He begins to preach, but something happens. He loses his place in his notes, can't find where he is. He stumbles through the sermon, stutters. He's embarrassed. He walks down with his head down. The old preacher says, "Son, if you would have gone up as you came down, you would have come down as you went up." In other words, if you went up with a very humble attitude, depending on God totally, you would have come down satisfied that God had spoken through you. The book of Proverbs tells us the story of the importance of humility in our lives. So we need to look at what is humility and why is humility such an important grace. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 12, "Before the destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, but before honor is humility." Why is pride so destructive, and what is humility? Pride indicates a lack of trust in God. It's exalting self above God. Pride trusts in the fallen human nature. It trusts in its own abilities. Do you remember the story told in Scripture of Lucifer and his pride? That story is found in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12 to 14. And Scripture says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, the son of the morning? How are you cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations? For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven." Now notice, Lucifer has eye problems. He needs a divine optometrist. "I will ascend into heaven." 5 times I is used. Wasn't he already in heaven? Yes, he wanted a higher place. "I will exalt my throne above the stars of God." Didn't he have a throne? Yes, but he wasn't content. He wanted a higher position. "I will also sit on the mount of the congregation in the farthest sides of the north." What does it mean that Lucifer would sit in the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north? Mount Sinai was to the north. That's where the law of God was administered. So Lucifer did not want to obey. He wanted to be the one who gave the law. It says, "I'll ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." So Lucifer wanted God's power, but not his character. Pride is so destructive because it substitutes human reasoning for God's divine truth. It substitutes the abilities of the creature far above the power of God, the Creator. It substitutes human logic for divine wisdom. Humility is simple dependence on God. James chapter 4, verse 6 declares, "But he gives more grace. Therefore," he says, "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." What is humility? Humility is trusting in God. Humility is recognizing that I can't, but God can. That I don't have the wisdom, but God does. I don't have the strength, but God does. Humility is not weakness, but it's rather humble trust upon God. Really, it enables me to become much stronger. Remember in the Beatitudes how Jesus puts it, Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is rather humble, trusting upon God, recognizing that He is the source of my wisdom, the source of my strength. A number of years ago, when I first went to the former Soviet Union, the situation was quite tense, and our leadership team there of the Seventh-day Adventist Church assigned to me a Russian bodyguard by the name of Boris. Now, Boris's story is quite remarkable. Boris always wanted to be part of the KGB, the secret police. His uncle was one of the guards of Stalin, and Boris admired his uncle. And so he went to KGB school, Boris did, and he learned psychological warfare. He learned how to detonate bombs and explosives. He learned judo. He learned the art of using weapons. He studied geography, culture, history, language. Boris just a brilliant person. And one day he was in a guard tower of the KGB. And as Boris was in this guard tower, it had rained and it was quite slippery. Stepped on a ladder, flipped, went down the staircase and broke his back. He was taken to a special KGB hospital. While in that hospital, he was lying on the bed and he was watching television, and he saw some of his KGB unit classmates that had graduated with him, now that were operatives, and he knew them, and he saw them in crowds, inciting riots here and there in republics in the Soviet Union that the Soviets wanted to dominate. And so he watched all that, and he said, that's not the lifestyle I want. And he began to think, where can I find peace and meaning? And he remembered on one occasion that he had heard a story about Jesus on a mountain giving a sermon. And he remembered some of the words of that sermon, and he called it the mountain sermon. Words like, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those that hunger and thirst after righteousness, blessed are the meek. And very humbly, very submissively, this KGB agent said, Jesus, I need you. Give me direction. He sent a letter to what he thought was the Orthodox priest, asking, have you ever heard of the mountain sermon? He didn't know the Sermon on the Mount. Have you ever heard of the mountain sermon? And I'd like to know more about it, and I'd like to know more about this man called Jesus. The letter ended up, because churches had their mailboxes similar so they could be controlled, not far from one another, in an Adventist pastor's mailbox. And the Adventist pastor read it. He visited Boris there at the KGB hospital, and he shared with him the principles of the Bible. He shared with him the story of Daniel and how Daniel's humility, Daniel purposed in his heart to serve God, and how Daniel in a foreign culture was dependent upon God. He shared with Boris the prophecies of the book of Daniel, the second chapter, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and the breakup of the Roman Empire, and the coming of Christ. Boris was so incredibly impressed with that he gave his heart to Jesus. Became my bodyguard. When I left Russia during those days, I gave Boris all my graphics, all my slides I was using for sermons. And his story is an amazing one because he becomes a Seventh Adventist pastor. And as a pastor, he becomes an evangelist and a leader in our church in Russia in various conferences or geographical units of our churches. God blesses the humble. Boris had the humility to seek God and not depend on his own sufficiency or his own brilliance. Wherever you are just now, God invites you to seek Him in His Word, to humbly come to Him and to let Him impress your heart, touch your mind, and change your life.